Good evening, and welcome to Footnotes Folly. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and tonight we open the 8th book of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the book the ancients called Urania. We carry on in plain modern English, from the first line, with nothing left out, still using Macaulay's public domain translation. The plain rendering, and the muttering, are my own. This is part 4-3. While Leonidas and his 300 are dying in the pass, the Greek fleet is fighting for its life in the Strait of Artemisium. 3 days of hard, bloody sea battles against the Persian navy many times its size, with a great storm thinning the enemy in between. The Greeks hold their own at sea, but when word comes that Thermopylae has fallen and the road south is open, there is nothing for the fleet to do but slip away in the dark towards Salamis. Let us begin.
The Hellenes who had been assigned to serve in the fleet were as follows. The Athenians provided 127 ships. The Plataeans, moved by courage and eagerness for the cause, joined the Athenians in manning those ships, even though they had no experience in seamanship. The Corinthians provided 40 ships, and the Megarenes 20. The Chalcidians manned 20 ships that the Athenians supplied to them. The Aeginetans provided 18 ships, the Sicyonians 12, the Lacedaemonians 10, the Epidaurians 8, the Eretrians 7, the Troezenians 5, the Styrians 2, and the Canes 2 ships, and 2 fifth-oared galleys. The Locrians of Opus also came to help the rest with 7 fifth-oared galleys. These were the forces that joined the expedition to Artemisium, and I have named them according to the number of ships each people supplied. The total number of ships gathered at Artemisium, not counting the fifth-oared galleys, was 271. The commander with supreme authority was supplied by the Spartans, Eurybates son of Euryclades. This was because the allies said that they would not serve under the Athenians, and that unless a Lacedaemonian led them, they would break up the expedition that was being planned. At first, even before they sent to Sicily to seek allies, it had been said that the fleet ought to be put under Athenian command. But when the allies resisted this, the Athenians gave way. They cared deeply that Hellas should be saved, and they understood that if they quarreled with one another over the command, Hellas would be destroyed. In this they judged rightly, because civil discord among people of the same race is worse than a united war by as much as war itself is worse than peace. Since they were convinced of this, they did not press their claim, but yielded for as long as they urgently needed the allies. Their later conduct proved that this was so. After they had driven the Persian away from their own land, and were fighting for Persian territory rather than for their own, they used the arrogance of Pausanias as a pretext, and took the leadership away from the Lacedaemonians. That, however, happened later. At this time, when the Hellenes who had come to Artemisium saw that a great number of ships had put in at Aphetai and that the whole place was filled with the enemy's force, they were struck with fear. The fortunes of the barbarians had turned out differently from what they had expected, and they began to consider retreating from Artemisium into the inner parts of Hellas. The Euboeans saw that they were discussing this, and they asked Eurybates to remain by them for a short time, until they could remove their children and households from the land. When they failed to persuade him, they went elsewhere and persuaded Themistocles, the Athenian commander, by paying him 30 talents, on the condition that the fleet would stay and fight the sea battle in front of Euboea. Themistocles made the Hellenes stay in this way. He gave Eurybates 5 talents from the sum, pretending that he was giving it from his own money. After Eurybates had been persuaded by him to change his mind, Adimantus son of Achitos, the Corinthian commander, was the only one of all the others who still resisted, saying that he would sail away from Artemisium and would not remain with them. "You at least shall not leave us. I will give you greater gifts than the king of the Medes would send you if you deserted your allies." So Themistocles spoke, and at the same time he sent 3 talents of silver to Adimantus' ship. In this way they had all been persuaded by gifts to change their minds. The request of the Euboeans was satisfied, and Themistocles himself made a profit. It was not known that he kept the rest of the money, and those who received a share of it were fully convinced that it had come from the Athenian state for this purpose. Thus they remained in Euboea and fought a sea battle. This is how it happened. When the barbarians arrived at Aphetai, around the beginning of the afternoon, they had already heard that a few ships of the Hellenes were stationed near Artemisium, and now they saw them for themselves. They were eager to attack and find out whether they could capture them. Yet they did not think it best to sail straight against them at once, because they feared that if the Hellenes saw them coming, they would set out in flight. Darkness would overtake them as they fled, and they would probably escape. According to the Persian calculation, it was right that not even the fire-bearer should escape and save his life. With this aim they devised the following plan. From the whole number of their ships, they separated 200 and sent them around outside Sciathos, so that the enemy would not see them as they sailed round Euboea by Caphreus and around Gyriastos to the Euripos. Their purpose was that these ships should come up by that route and block the enemy's retreat, while the main force advanced directly against them, so that the Hellenes would be surrounded on every side. After forming this plan, they began sending off the ships assigned to that task. They themselves had no intention of attacking the Hellenes that day, nor of doing so until the agreed signal should be displayed by the ships sailing round, to show that they had arrived. These ships, then, they were sending around, while they counted the rest at Aphetai. During this numbering of the ships, the following event occurred. In that camp there was a man of Scione named Scylius, the best diver of all the men of that time. In the shipwreck that had taken place by Pelion, he had saved much of the Persians' property for them, and he had also gained much for himself. It seems that this Scylius had already intended before this to desert to the Hellenes, but until then he had not been able to do so. I cannot say with certainty how he actually reached the Hellenes after this attempt, but I marvel if the story told about him is true. It is said that he dived into the sea at Aphet, and did not come up until he reached Artemisium, passing under the sea for somewhere around 80 furlongs. Many other tales are told about this man, some of which seem likely to be false, though some are true. About this matter, however, let me give my opinion. He came to Artemisium in a boat. When he arrived, he immediately informed the commanders about the shipwreck, telling them how it had happened, and also told them about the ships that had been sent away to sail round Euboea. When the Hellenes heard this, they discussed the matter among themselves. After many things had been said, the opinion that prevailed was that they should stay there that day and encamp on shore, and then, after midnight had passed, set out to meet the ship sailing round. After this, however, since no one sailed out to attack them, they waited until the late hours of the afternoon, and then sailed out themselves against the barbarians, wanting to test both their manner of fighting and their trick of breaking the line. When the men in Xerxes' army, commanders as well as the rest, saw the Hellenes sailing against them with so few ships, they judged that they must be driven by sheer madness. They also put their own ships out to sea, expecting to capture them easily. Their expectation was reasonable enough, since they saw that the Hellenic ships were few, while their own were many times more numerous and sailed better. With this confidence, they came around and enclosed the Hellenes in the middle. Then those Ionians who were well disposed toward the Hellenes, and were serving in the expedition against their will, felt great grief when they saw them surrounded. They were sure that not one of them would return home, so weak did they think the Hellenic force was. But those who were pleased by what was happening competed with one another, each trying to be the first to take an Athenian ship and receive gifts from the king, for in their camps the Athenians were talked about more than any of the others. Meanwhile, when the signal was given, the Hellenes first arranged themselves with their prows facing the barbarians and drew their sterns together in the middle. When the signal was given a second time, although they were confined in a narrow space and prow stood against prow, they set to work vigorously. They captured 30 of the barbarian ships, and also Phalan son of Chersus, the brother of Gorgos king of the Salaminians, a man of great reputation in the army. The first of the Hellenes to capture an enemy's ship was an Athenian, Lycomedes son of Atreus, and he received the prize for valor. As they were fighting this sea battle with the result still uncertain, nightfall separated them from one another. The Hellenes accordingly sailed away to Artemisium, and the barbarians to Aphet, the contest having turned out very differently from what the barbarians had expected. In this sea fight, Herodotus of Lemnos was the only one of the Hellenes who were with the king who deserted to the Hellenic side, and because of this deed the Athenians gave him a piece of land in Salamis. When darkness had come on, although it was the middle of summer, very heavy rain began and lasted through the whole night, with crashing thunder from Mount Pelion. Dead bodies and pieces of wreckage were carried up at Aphet, became tangled around the prows of the ships, and struck against the blades of the oars. The men of the army who were there heard these things and became afraid, expecting that they would certainly perish, since they had fallen into such troubles. Before they had even had breathing space after the shipwreck and the storm that had arisen off Mount Pelion, a hard sea fight had come upon them, and after the sea fight came a violent rainstorm, strong streams rushing down to the sea, and crashing thunder. Such was the night that these men had. Meanwhile, those of them who had been assigned to sail round Euboea experienced the same night, but it raged far more fiercely against them, because it struck them while they were making their course on the open sea. Its end proved disastrous for them. When the storm and rain together came upon them as they were sailing off the hollows of Euboea, they were driven by the wind, not knowing where they were being carried, and were wrecked upon the rocks. All this was being brought about by God so that the Persian force might be made more equal to that of the Hellenes, and not be vastly larger. These men then were perishing around the hollows of Euboea. Meanwhile the barbarians at Aphet were glad when day dawned on them. They kept their ships quiet, and in their miserable condition were content to remain still for the present. But 53 Athenian ships came as reinforcements to the Hellenes. Their arrival gave the Hellenes more courage, and they were encouraged at the same time by the report that all the barbarians who had been sailing round Euboea had been destroyed by the storm that had taken place. They waited for the same time of day as before, then sailed out and attacked some Cilician ships. After destroying them, they sailed away when darkness came and returned to Artemisium. On the third day, the barbarian commanders were exceedingly indignant that so small a number of ships should be doing them damage, and they feared what Xerxes might do. This time they did not wait for the Hellenes to begin the fight, but passed along the word of command, and put their ships to sea around midday. It happened that these sea battles, and the land battles at Thermopylae, took place on the same days. For those fighting by sea, the whole struggle centered on the channel of Euripus, just as the aim of Leonidas and his band was to guard the pass. The Hellenes exhorted one another not to let the barbarians pass into Hellas, while the barbarians urged one another to destroy the fleet of the Hellenes and take possession of the straits. While the forces of Xerxes were sailing in order toward them, the Hellenes remained quiet at Artemisium. The barbarians formed their ships into a crescent so that they might enclose the Hellenes, and they tried to surround them. Then the Hellenes put out to sea and engaged them. In this battle the two sides were nearly equal. The fleet of Xerxes, because of its great size and numbers, suffered damage from itself, since the ships were thrown into confusion and ran into one another. Nevertheless, it held its ground, and did not give way, because they disdained being put to flight by so few ships. Many Hellenic ships were destroyed and many men died, but far more ships and men of the barbarians were lost. After fighting in this way, the two sides separated and each went back to its own place. In this sea fight the Egyptians did best among the men who fought for Xerxes. Besides other great deeds that they performed, they captured 5 Hellenic ships together with their crews. Of the Hellenes, those who did best on this day were the Athenians, and among the Athenians, Cleinias, son of Alcibiades, stood out. He was serving with 200 men and a ship of his own, bearing the expense himself from his private means. When the fighting ended, both sides gladly hurried to their moorings. After they had separated and escaped from the sea battle, the Hellenes possessed the bodies of the dead and the wrecks of the ships. Yet they had suffered severely, especially the Athenians, half of whose ships had been disabled, and they were now considering a retreat into the inner parts of Hellas. Themistocles, however, had formed the idea that if the Ionian and Carian nations could be detached from the barbarian force, the Hellenes would be able to overcome the rest. When the people of Euboea were driving their flocks down to that sea, he gathered the generals and told them that he thought he had a plan by which he hoped to make the best of the king's allies leave him. He revealed only this much about the matter. As for their present situation, he said that they must act as follows. Each man should slaughter as many of the Euboeans' flocks as he wanted, because it was better for their own army to have them than for the enemy to have them. He also advised that each commander order his own men to kindle a fire. As for the time of their departure, he said he would arrange it so that they would reach Hellas safely. They were content to do this, and at once, when they had kindled a fire, they turned their attention to the flocks. In truth, the Euboeans had disregarded the oracle of Bacchus as if it meant nothing at all. They had neither carried anything away from their land nor laid in any store of provisions in expectation that war would come upon them, and by this conduct they had brought trouble on themselves. For the oracle spoken by Bacchus about these things ran as follows: Mark, when a barbarian man shall yoke the sea with papyrus, then plan to remove the loud, bleating goats from Euboea. In the evils that were then upon them, or soon to be expected, they had good reason to regret that they had paid no attention to these lines. While they were occupied in this way, the scout from Trachis came to them. At Artemisium there was a scout named Polius, a native of Anticyra, whose duty it was, if the fleet should be disabled, to report this to those at Thermopylae. He had a vessel equipped and ready for that purpose. In the same way, with Leonidas there was a Bernicius, son of Lysicles, an Athenian, ready to carry news to those at Artemisium in a 30-oared galley if any disaster should happen to the land army. This Bernicius had now arrived, and he reported to them what had happened to Leonidas and his army. When they learned this, they no longer delayed their retreat, but set out in the order in which they had been stationed, the Corinthians first and the Athenians last. Themistocles, however, chose the Athenian ships that sailed best and went around to the springs of drinking water, cutting inscriptions on the stones there. The Ionians read these inscriptions when they came to Artemisium on the following day. The inscriptions said, "Ionians, you are not acting rightly in making an expedition against the fathers of your race and trying to enslave Hellas. Best of all would be for you to come over and be on our side. But if you cannot do that, then even now stand aside from the battle against us and ask the Carians to do the same as you. If neither of these two things is possible, and you are bound by too strong a compulsion to revolt, then when we meet in battle, be deliberately slack. Remember that you are descended from us, and that our quarrel with the barbarian first began because of you." Themistocles wrote this, as I suppose, with two purposes in mind at once. Either the inscriptions might escape the king's notice and cause the Ionians to change sides and come over to him, or if they were reported and denounced to Xerxes, they might make him distrust the Ionians, and therefore keep them apart from the sea battles. After Themistocles had set up these inscriptions, a man of Histia came immediately to the barbarians in a boat, bringing word of the retreat of the Hellenes from Artemisium. They did not believe it, so they kept the messenger under guard and sent swift sailing ships ahead to look. When these ships reported the facts, that at last, as daylight was spreading over the sky, the whole armament sailed together to Artemisium. After staying there until midday, they sailed on to Histia. When they arrived, they took possession of the city of Histia and overran all the villages along the coast in the region of Olopia, which is the land of Histia. While they were there, Xerxes, after making arrangements concerning the bodies of the dead, sent a herald to the fleet. The arrangements he had made beforehand were these: of all the men of his army who lay dead at Thermopylae, as many as 20,000 in all, he buried all except about 1,000. He had trenches dug for them, covered them with leaves, and heaped earth over them, so that they would not be seen by the men of the fleet. Then, when the herald had gone over to Histia, he gathered the whole force in assembly. "Allies, King Xerxes grants permission to any one of you who wishes to leave his post and come see how he fights against those most senseless men who expected to overcome the power of the king." When the herald had made this proclamation, boats were more in demand than anything else, so many men wanted to see the sight. After they crossed over, they went among the dead bodies and looked at them. Everyone supposed that those lying there were all Lacedaemonians or Thespians, though the Helots were also among those they saw. Yet those who crossed over did not fail to notice what Xerxes had done with the bodies of his own dead, as I have mentioned. In truth, it was something laughable. On one side 1,000 dead bodies could be seen lying there, while the others, 4,000 of them, lay all gathered together in the same place. They spent that day looking, and on the next day they sailed back to the ships at Histea, while Xerxes and his army set out on their march. A few deserters from Arcadia had also come to them, men in need of a livelihood and wanting to be employed. The Persians brought them into the king's presence and questioned them about what the Hellenes were doing. One man asked the questions for all the rest. The Arcadians said that the Hellenes were holding the Olympic festival and were watching contests of athletics and horsemanship. He then asked what prize was offered for which they competed, and they told him about the wreath of olive that is given. Then Tigranes, son of Artabanos, uttered a thought that was most noble, though because of it he received from the king the reproach of cowardice. When he heard that the prize was a wreath and not money, he could not bear to keep silent, but spoke in the presence of everyone. "Ah, Mardonios, what kind of men are these against whom you have brought us to fight, men who compete not for money but for honor?"
And there we will pause, with the Greek fleet rowing south by night and the whole of central Greece now open to Xerxes. Next time, in part 4-4, the Persian army pours down into Greece. A picked force is sent to plunder Delphi and is held back by the god himself, and the people of Athens make the hardest choice of all to abandon their city to the flames. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.